I loved him without armor. Every piece of me was exposed, every fear, every hope, every scar. I believed love alone could heal everything, that my devotion was enough to bridge the distance between us, to fill the silence that sometimes lingered in his eyes. Friends warned me, whispered that I was too trusting, that I gave too much and expected too little in return. But I didn't listen. I believed that loving fully meant staying fully, even when he faltered. I forgave quickly, smiled through hurt, convinced that patience was the truest form of strength. He never knew how fragile my heart sometimes felt, or maybe he did, and that was what made it dangerous. I thought love could be enough to protect me from pain. I was wrong. Every act of love I poured into him was a seed of misunderstanding, a silent message he read as weakness. And yet, I kept loving. Without shield, without condition, without fear. It was who I was, a woman who loved too deeply, hoping that one day, my love would be recognized for what it was, loyalty, not fragility. His words felt safe. Every "I'll always be here" felt like a fortress. I hung on them, memorized their rhythm, trusted their cadence. But his words had a secret, one I only discovered too late. Lies hid inside the syllables, wrapped carefully in warmth and charm. Each promise was a mask, each declaration a shadow of truth. I wanted to believe him so badly that I ignored the signs, the inconsistencies, the tiny cracks forming in our foundation. When I questioned him, he smiled, a disarming curve of his lips that silenced doubts before they even formed. I told myself I was lucky to have someone so attentive, so loving. But love built on half-truths is fragile. I didn't notice the small betrayals, the tiny moments where his affection was calculated, not genuine. I held on to his words as if they were anchors, unaware they were chains. I gave him my time, my heart, my trust, all based on promises that sounded unbreakable. But the truth doesn't hide forever. And the day it finally emerged, the fortress of words crumbled, revealing the man behind the mask. He stopped choosing me, and I noticed it first in the small things. The way he ignored my texts, how laughter in his voice faded when I walked into the room, how he stopped noticing my efforts. I was no longer a priority, I was routine. Love, once a vibrant flame, became a habit for him. Something he assumed rather than cherished. I confronted myself with a painful truth. I was holding on to someone who no longer saw me as essential, who mistook my devotion for granted stability. I tried talking, tried explaining, but he waved my words aside. The man I loved had grown complacent, blind to the depth of my heart. My presence no longer inspired him, it reassured him. And that reassured him that he could act without fear of consequence. I stayed because I wanted to, because I believed love meant endurance. Yet endurance without respect is invisible suffering. I began to see the cracks clearly, to hear the silence where affection used to live. It was the moment I realized love can be mistaken for weakness. And that realization planted the first seeds of awakening. It started small, almost unnoticeable, a word, a tone, a careless disregard. He said something cruel, not even thinking about it, and I forgave him. I rationalized it, told myself everyone has moments of impatience, moments of weakness. But forgiveness teaches more than compassion. It teaches boundaries, or in my case, the lack of them. The moment I forgave, he learned I would stay, that I would accept without retaliation. That forgiveness, my instinctive choice, became his guidebook for cruelty. He tested me gently at first, the way a child dips a toe into a pool to see how deep it is. Each act of disrespect I let slide added inches to the distance between us, but he didn't notice. I continued loving, smiling, pretending nothing hurt, while inside, a quiet awareness grew. I was learning, slowly, that every act of indulgence strengthens the wrong side. I forgave because I loved, but he used that love as a measure of my weakness. Little did he know that first forgiveness was the turning point. The subtle hint that one day, my patience would evolve into something far less forgiving. Care was once abundant, evident in every glance, every gesture. But over time, the attention faded. Conversations became transactional, laughter forced, smiles rehearsed. I felt it first as a hollowness, a space where warmth had been, a vacuum that my heart instinctively tried to fill. I tried to speak, to prompt his awareness, but he ignored me. The pain of being unseen is quieter than anger, heavier than sorrow. He noticed my hurt, yet did nothing to soothe it. The silence was not accidental, it was deliberate. I realized he had grown comfortable in my pain, assuming it was part of the love I offered, never questioning it, never feeling responsible. That silence was louder than words, and its echo reshaped how I viewed him. I began to observe, to catalog every small disregard, each absence of care, each moment I was taken for granted. I smiled externally, performed love, hid my growing realization. Love alone does not heal neglect, and patience does not teach respect. Silence, in its cruel subtlety, revealed the truth. He mistook my love for weakness, and the awakening had begun. My patience became his playground. The lines between love and tolerance blurred, and he crossed every boundary I had silently set. What once seemed like minor negligence evolved into blatant disrespect. He grew bold, testing me in ways I had never imagined, assuming my loyalty would shield him from consequences. Every careless word, every dismissive glance, every night he returned late with excuses I didn't question, built the invisible walls between us. I watched quietly, cataloging his arrogance, understanding now that love can be mistaken for weakness. He believed my heart could take anything because he had never seen me break. But beneath the calm exterior, I was awake, noticing patterns he could not see. He thrived on my patience, unaware that each act of cruelty was teaching me how to endure without surrendering my dignity. I stopped defending myself verbally, stopped pleading for his recognition. Instead, I observed. I noted every slight, every lie, every manipulation. He was growing reckless, and I was growing sharp. Patience, once my virtue, had become the weapon he had unknowingly forged. And when the time came, I would use it. It happened unexpectedly. A single sentence, whispered carelessly, shattered the fragile world I had built around him. I had been walking past the room when words I wasn't meant to hear slipped through the door. Betrayal doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sneaks quietly, like poison in water. The truth revealed his intentions, his indifference, his hidden desires. I froze, the room spinning around me as my heart tried to reconcile the person I loved with the person he actually was. Every promise, every smile, every gesture suddenly recontextualized, stripped bare of sincerity. For a moment I felt nothing. Shock is a heavy blanket. Then a slow burn of anger replaced the numbness, mingled with sorrow for the years spent giving freely to someone undeserving. The realization struck: he never valued me, never truly loved me, and every act of affection had been assumed, taken for granted. I left that room without confrontation, my silence deliberate. I understood that knowledge without reaction gives clarity, and with clarity came a plan, one that would no longer allow him to mistake my love for weakness. Betrayal is not loud. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It comes softly, like the snap of a twig underfoot, subtle but irrevocable. It has a sound, though, if you listen carefully. The silence after the confession, the hollow laugh that follows deception, the voice that avoids your gaze. I learned that sound that day. Every word he had hidden, every excuse, every false smile, it formed a pattern, a symphony of deceit. My chest tightened as I replayed it, over and over, the quiet weight of his betrayal pressing on me. The sound was permanent, echoing in spaces where love once lived. Pain arrived in measured tones, not abrupt ones, and it carried the knowledge that nothing could undo what had been done. I realized that betrayal reshapes perception, that trust once broken echoes louder than any scream. I smiled outwardly, but inside, I cataloged everything. Every action, every lie, every moment of careless disregard became a memory etched in sharp relief. He mistook my tolerance for weakness, but betrayal has a sound, and I had finally learned to hear it clearly. He thought my composure meant I was broken, that the tears hidden behind smiles were signs of surrender. He had no idea that every drop of pain fueled my awareness, sharpened my focus, and strengthened my resolve. I smiled at his jokes, laughed at moments that once felt like joy, and nodded when he spoke, all while my heart quietly bled. Every pang of sorrow became a building block for the version of me he had never imagined. I let him believe he had the power to wound me endlessly, all the while planning my own form of reckoning. Love had made me patient, but betrayal had made me strategic. I observed him, his habits, his arrogance, his careless confidence, and learned to anticipate his moves. I acted like a woman who had been broken, but beneath the facade, I was learning to wield my pain like a weapon. He mistook my endurance for weakness, not realizing that endurance, tempered with awareness, can become unstoppable. And in that moment, as I smiled through the ache, I felt a quiet thrill. He had no idea what was coming. He had never seen me fully. I had hidden layers beneath the devotion he assumed was simplicity. Now, stripped of illusions, I discovered a version of myself he would never recognize. I stopped explaining, stopped pleading for recognition, and started observing instead. I studied his patterns, his flaws, his arrogance, and cataloged every detail. The quiet, patient woman he thought he understood had been a surface layer, a mask that concealed sharp intelligence, strategic thinking, and an inner fire. I was no longer reactive, I was deliberate. I realized that he had taken my love for granted, assumed my loyalty was weakness, and underestimated the strength that grew silently behind every smile, every compromise, every forgivable offense. The woman he knew was soft, yielding, and forgiving. The woman I had become was calculating, aware, and ready to reclaim power that had been quietly stolen. I embraced this new version fully, letting go of fear and attachment, preparing for the moment when my silence would speak louder than any words he had ever heard. Pain has a way of clarifying everything. Once, I believed love was the answer to all problems, that devotion could erase neglect and silence. But the truth emerged gradually, painfully, and it revealed a world I had refused to see. Love alone cannot shield you from betrayal. I began to notice how my forgiveness had been mistaken for weakness, how my loyalty had been assumed, and how every act of care I gave had been taken for granted. Clarity arrived quietly, like sunlight cutting through fog. I stopped excusing his behavior and began seeing it for what it was: arrogance and entitlement. With clarity came a shift in perspective. I realized I could no longer rely on love as my armor. It had been stripped away. Instead, I needed strategy, awareness, and self-respect. The woman he thought he knew, patient and forgiving, was still there, but beneath her exterior, a sharper, wiser version was emerging. Pain had broken illusions but strengthened resolve. I finally understood. Love can teach lessons, but clarity teaches power, and I was ready to wield it. Quiet women are dangerous when awakened. He had grown comfortable with my patience, assuming it was endless, mistaking my silence for submission. Every word I didn't speak, every tear I hid, every resentment swallowed, became fuel for my awareness. He had no idea that behind my calm exterior, I was calculating, observing, and preparing. He continued with his arrogance, unaware that each careless act, each thoughtless word, was building the case against him in the court of my conscience. Silence is deceptive, it hides a storm, and storms have a way of breaking barriers unexpectedly. I had learned to measure his habits, to anticipate his actions, and to see the cracks he assumed were invisible. The power dynamic was shifting quietly, imperceptibly, but irreversibly. He mistook my silence for weakness, but in reality, it was the first step toward reclaiming control. One day, when he least expected it, the woman he dismissed as docile would speak. Not in words, but through actions that would leave no doubt about the strength he never recognized. My silence was not surrender, it was strategy, and I was ready. While he laughed at my supposed fragility, I quietly rebuilt myself. Every piece of trust he broke, every lie he told, every moment of disregard became a building block for my own empowerment. I enrolled in courses I had postponed, focused on work and personal growth, strengthened relationships I had neglected, and rediscovered passions he had ignored. I didn't announce my transformation. I didn't post it online or declare it to friends. It was mine, a silent reclamation of power. He assumed I was broken, distracted, lost in heartbreak, but every day I became more whole. I dressed with care, moved with confidence, spoke with precision, and projected a presence he could no longer control. While he assumed my patience was weakness, I was fortifying strength. Every smile I gave him masked determination. Every question I refrained from asking sharpened my focus. He didn't see the change until it was undeniable, until the woman he thought he had underestimated became unrecognizable in her strength, independence, and resolve. Rebuilding without announcing it, it gave me power he could never steal. He never saw it coming. The subtle shift in our dynamic went unnoticed because it was invisible to him. While he acted with the same arrogance, I moved with quiet precision. Decisions he once controlled were now mine to shape. Conversations he dominated, I now redirected. His confidence, built on assumptions about my tolerance, began to falter as he realized he no longer dictated the rhythm of our interactions. The power had shifted, silently but decisively. He mistook my patience for weakness, my forgiveness for fragility, and my loyalty for submission. Yet every act he underestimated fueled my ascendancy. Friends noticed the change in me before he did. How I carried myself, how I responded with poise instead of pleading, how I no longer allowed disrespect to linger unchallenged. Each encounter reinforced the reversal. He was losing the control he never fully had, and I was stepping into authority I had quietly nurtured. The woman he thought he had tamed was now untouchable in her awareness and power. And the irony? He still thought he was winning. It happened unexpectedly, and the timing was cruelly ironic. He reached for me in desperation, seeking what he had taken for granted, what he assumed would always be there, my support, my loyalty, my love. But the woman he had underestimated, the one he had mistreated and dismissed, no longer existed in the form he expected. I listened silently, observing his tone, his urgency, the subtle hints of fear beneath his request. I had grown beyond being a convenience or an accessory to his life. Every moment of disregard, every slight, every unkind word he had spoken was now part of the record he could not erase. And while he pleaded, I felt no rush to respond. Power lies in timing, in choice, in knowing that the person who mistook you for weakness now controls the outcome. His need revealed everything he had lost, and I felt neither anger nor pity, only clarity. The woman he once thought fragile now stood strong, unmoved by pleas and unshaken by regret. He needed me, but I had already chosen me. I watched silently as he stumbled into consequences he had always assumed I would shield him from. His arrogance blinded him, making him careless, predictable, and unaware that I had learned every pattern, every weakness, every lie. I didn't push him. I didn't manipulate. I let him move freely, believing he was untouchable, because I knew his downfall would be his own doing. Every word he spoke, every decision he made, confirmed what I already understood. Love had taught me patience, betrayal had taught me strategy. I simply stepped aside and observed. The thrill wasn't in revenge, it was in watching justice, naturally unfolding, using him as its instrument. He never suspected that the woman he mistook for weak had grown strong, that her silence contained observation, calculation, and foresight. I had become a shadow he couldn't predict, a force moving quietly while he built his own cage. When the trap snapped, I would not rejoice, but I would acknowledge the inevitability. He had been given countless warnings, countless chances to respect and value me, yet he chose ignorance. Now, the consequences were entirely his own, and I was free from complicity. He noticed it first in the spaces I no longer occupied, the calls unanswered, the presence he assumed was constant, the care he thought was infinite. Panic flickered in his eyes when he realized I had left without fanfare, without explanation. Too late is heavier than regret, he learned that suddenly. I had prepared for this day carefully, not out of cruelty, but because clarity demanded boundaries, and self-respect demanded distance. He searched for traces of me in the routines he had once controlled, only to find absence, quiet, and undeniable. The same woman who had smiled through heartbreak, tolerated disrespect, and forgave too quickly, had vanished from his world. In my absence, every misdeed became apparent, every assumption exposed. I observed his attempts to reach me, the realization that loyalty cannot be forced, and the panic that accompanies belated understanding. I had left, but not without purpose. I was reclaiming my life, my peace, and my dignity. He mistook my love for weakness, and the moment he understood the truth, it was irreversible. Freedom is not loud, sometimes it is simply not returning. When he finally spoke, it was not with love, not with regret, but with fear. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by hesitation and uncertainty. He approached cautiously as though testing boundaries he had long ignored, as if my presence could still be assumed. But I had changed. I no longer needed his validation, his attention, or his apologies to feel whole. Fear, not love, dripped from every word, every glance, every attempt to regain ground. I listened quietly, without giving reassurance, without softening his words. The imbalance was now clear. He had lost power, and that loss terrified him. His apologies revealed more than remorse. They revealed desperation, the recognition of mistakes too late to mend. I held nothing against him, not because I forgave, but because I had moved beyond needing resolution from him. My focus was myself, my growth, my peace. And as he spoke, I felt a calm satisfaction. He had learned too late, and fear was the only response available to someone who had underestimated strength he mistook for weakness. I had won, not in vengeance, but in reclaiming myself. For the first time in years, I chose myself without hesitation, without guilt, without apology. Every decision, every boundary I set was an affirmation of my worth. Love had taught me generosity, patience, and devotion, but betrayal taught me self-respect and the power of choice. I no longer allowed his actions or words to define my value. I pursued my passions, strengthened my body and mind, and embraced a freedom I had only imagined before. Choosing myself did not require him to be punished or humiliated. It required me to step fully into the life I had neglected while bending to his whims. The peace of independence was intoxicating, a clarity that joy cannot hide. Each day I lived intentionally, confidently, and unapologetically. I smiled freely, laughed deeply, and felt empowered knowing my loyalty was no longer assumed, no longer exploited. Love may have been misinterpreted, but strength, self-awareness, and the courage to prioritize myself were unmistakable. I had become my own protector, my own sanctuary. No longer a victim of assumptions, I had reclaimed control. Choosing myself was liberation, and for the first time, I felt completely unshakable. There is a strange satisfaction in witnessing someone's arrogance crumble. He had once controlled the narrative, assumed dominance, and mistook patience for weakness. Now the tables had turned, and he fumbled with the very control he had once taken for granted. His gestures were hurried, his words clumsy, his confidence shattered. I observed quietly, unaffected, knowing that life has its own way of balancing scales. Karma doesn't rush, it moves in its own time, with precision and inevitability. Every misstep he made was a reflection of choices he had made long before, and I remained calm, detached, secure in my own power. There was no gloating, no schadenfreude, only clarity and quiet satisfaction. The man who believed he could manipulate, control, and underestimate me now faced the consequences of his ignorance. And as I watched, I realized how far I had come. No longer timid, no longer forgiving without reflection, no longer dependent on his recognition. I was free, strong, and untouchable. Watching him lose control confirmed what I had known all along. He mistook my love for weakness, and it had been his fatal error. He never understood the depth of my strength. To him, I had always been patient, forgiving, and loyal, qualities he misread as fragility. He never noticed the quiet resilience that carried me through every betrayal, every disappointment, every silent tear. My strength was built slowly, brick by brick, through years of endurance, observation, and self-reflection. While he assumed love made me weak, it had actually taught me perseverance, empathy, and courage, the kind that doesn't need validation. Every slight, every disrespect, every instance of being taken for granted had reinforced the steel inside me. He was oblivious, blinded by arrogance, convinced I would always endure. But endurance is not submission, it is preparation. And I was ready. The woman he underestimated, the one he assumed was fragile, had grown unstoppable. My voice, my mind, and my presence were no longer tools for his convenience, they belonged to me. Strength, once invisible to him, became my armor. I moved freely, with confidence, and I knew my worth without needing his approval. He never valued what I carried silently, and now he faced a world where I could thrive entirely on my own. He attempted to change the narrative, to make it seem as though his mistakes were minor, as though I had misunderstood, as though his arrogance had been justified. But rewriting the story does not erase the truth. It does not undo betrayal or disrespect. I listened quietly as he spoke, noting every attempt to manipulate perception, every feigned regret, every claim that his actions had been misinterpreted. I had learned to see through masks, to recognize half-truths, and to discern when words were empty. My silence was not weakness, it was my judgment, carefully observing the distance between intention and reality. He could not alter the facts, the memories, or the pain he caused. I remembered every detail, every slight, every moment he mistook love for weakness. I did not engage in debate, I did not justify my responses. I simply acknowledged internally that the story he wanted to tell was not the story I had lived. And in that acknowledgement, I found power. The woman he had tried to control was no longer confined by his version of events. I owned my story completely. Closure is often mistaken for forgiveness, but they are not the same. I realized that walking away, setting boundaries, and reclaiming my life provided more peace than forcing reconciliation ever could. I didn't need his acknowledgement, his apology, or his understanding. My closure was internal, rooted in self-respect and awareness. I reflected on every moment, every betrayal, every misstep, and instead of holding anger or resentment, I held clarity. I knew what had happened, I understood my worth, and I chose to step forward without carrying the weight of his mistakes. Forgiveness would have required dependence on his actions. Closure required nothing from him. I was free to rebuild, to love myself, and to pursue life without the shadows of his misjudgments. He had mistaken my love for weakness, and I had learned that I did not need his recognition to validate my strength. True closure comes from understanding your own power, accepting reality, and moving forward with confidence. And in that quiet acceptance, I felt complete, whole, and unshakable. Pain did not break me, it crowned me. Every betrayal, every slight, every deception had been a teacher, shaping me into someone stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. I rose not with vengeance but with clarity, knowing that my life, my joy, and my freedom could not be defined by someone who failed to value me. I embraced my independence, celebrated my victories, and nurtured the parts of myself I had neglected in pursuit of his attention. Strength became my language, awareness my shield, and confidence my armor. I no longer needed permission to exist fully, to love fully, to pursue dreams without hesitation. The woman who had loved too deeply, who had been assumed weak, now stood tall, unafraid, and unstoppable. Every scar became a story of resilience, every tear, a step toward empowerment. Rising from betrayal was not about punishment, it was about transformation. I had evolved beyond assumptions, beyond expectations, beyond the limitations others tried to place upon me. And as I looked forward, I realized that the greatest victory of all was becoming the woman he had never imagined existed. And that mistake cost him everything. He assumed I would endure endlessly, that my patience and loyalty were signs of fragility. He never realized that every act of love I gave, every compromise I made, every time I forgave, was silently teaching me strategy, patience, and strength. His arrogance blinded him to the resilience growing quietly in my heart. When he finally faced the consequences of his actions, he discovered that love is not weakness, and patience is not submission. I had evolved beyond his perception, beyond his control, and beyond the narrative he had written for us. The woman he underestimated had reclaimed her power, her independence, and her dignity. He wanted apologies, loyalty, and the familiar devotion he once took for granted, but I had already chosen myself. I had risen, unshaken, and unstoppable. In mistaking my love for weakness, he lost the one person who had truly cared for him, the one person who had seen him clearly and loved despite it. And in that loss, I found the ultimate freedom, the power to live fully, without regret, without him, and without compromise.